Hello and welcome back to the Stevenson Weekender Sailboat build. In this episode I'm going to create and then install the rub rails for the outside of the boat. I bought this mahogany at my local Menards, and I began by ripping these 1x6s into thirds. These rub rails need to be just a little over 16 feet long, but the longest board that Menards sold is 8 feet long. So to get the length of board that I needed, I'm going to join two 8-foot sections along with a smaller 2-foot section using scarf joints. In order to create these scarf joints, I'm going to throw together this jig to use on the bandsaw. This first piece is just a small fence to hold the boards at a 90-degree angle when on the bandsaw table. My camera wasn't on when I made this piece, but it's essentially just a scrap of plywood that I screwed this old T-slot runner onto and then ran it through the blade. I then referenced off that saw curve and drew out lines for a 12-to-1 scarf joint cut. This basically means that for every 12 inches of cut, I'll create a slope of 1 inch. The scarf joint is used to create a lot of surface area for the glue that'll bind the two boards together. Now I will attach that fence I made along that line. Here's how it works. I added that little stop block so I can get consistent starting point on each cut. I'll then clamp my board against that 90-degree fence and make my cut. Some of the boards had a slight twist in them, so I used that spring clamp close to the blade as possible and kept walking it backwards as I made my cut to keep the blade from deflecting as much as possible. I wanted the end result of the joint to have a clean line, so rather than feather that cut all the way out to the edge of the board, I made this step in each of the scarf joints. So then I just repeated that process for all my scarf joints. And here you can see how the two pieces mate together. Now I'll get all the joints glued together with some thickened epoxy and clamped in place. So here you can see I ended up with some boards that are just over 17 feet long. And there's that clean line of the joint. To clean up everything and to get a uniform thickness on all the boards, I sent them through the thickness planer. First I sent them through on their face, and then I ganged them all together along their width and sent them through that way. This brought the boards all to an equal width and also gave me a square edge on both sides. And here's how that scarf joint looked after it ran through the planer. Now I'm going to put a 3/8 inch round over on the edge of each board. These rails are 3/4 of an inch thick and about 1.5 inches wide, but the plans call for a smaller 3/4 by 3/4 piece inboard in order to trim out the top, as you'll see in a few minutes. So after moving my saw back to allow for passing these long pieces through the table saw into my shop, I set up some feather boards and then ripped one of the rails in half. I then used that same 3/8 inch round over bit to round over the freshly cut side of that small piece. This piece of trim will be used to cover the top edge of the plywood that is the side holes of the boat. So I'm going to cut a notch to allow for that. And as you can see, I again have the feather board set up to keep the board pressed firmly against the fence and down against the blade. So now we're back down at the boat shed with one of the rails, and this was one of the more subjective aspects of the build. What I mean by that is that the plans call for a recommended height of the rail at the bow and the stern, but the height of the rail midship is left up to the builder's choice. So I had two of my daughters, and I believe my mom stopped by, and we all gave opinion on the position of the rail midship, and we moved it up and down a few times until we got something that we liked. I then took a pencil and marked along the bottom edge of the rail. I then used that line as a reference to make another mark with this compass that I'll then come back along and cut with the saw to define the top edge of the side hull. I debated on whether or not to include this next part, but I thought one of the harder things about these rub rails was to get the two top edges to match starboard and port. In other words, I wanted the piece of trim to be the same distance all along the deck on both sides. So the method I came up with was to use a tape measure to make a mark every 12 inches along both sides of the boat. I had just finished cutting the starboard side top edge, and so I came along and every 12-inch mark I made a measurement from the top deck up to the edge of the side hull. I then transferred that same measurement at each mark along the port side. I then transferred these marks to the outside of the hull and laid a tape line along each mark to give me a consistent curve that should match the opposite side. I'll then come with my saw and make a cut along the top edge of that tape. I then got the rails dry fitted in place, and some pilot holes for screws were put in about every 6 to 12 inches along the length of the rub rail. These rails will be varnished rather than painted, so any exposed areas I first covered up with blue painter's tape, and then removed the rails and also put painter's tape along the bottom edge to prevent any marring from any epoxy squeeze out. I'm again using TotalBoat 5:1 epoxy thickened with silica, and then we'll get the rails put back in place along the top edge of the hull. I just worked my way along from center and lined the rail up with that pencil mark that I had made previously along the bottom edge. I'll then strengthen the joint with some of the stainless steel 3/4 inch screws through the hole into the rail. As far as this blue tape goes, I found that it was best to let the epoxy gel up just a little and then remove it before the epoxy was completely hardened. I then did the same procedure for the other side. The lower rail requires this compound angle so it'll mesh with the stem, and then I made marks and pre-drilled for screws about 5.5 inches below the upper rail. Again, to prevent contaminating the look of the wood with any epoxy squeeze out, I first came along and taped the upper and lower edge of this board before I glued it in place. Getting this lower rail glued on was definitely a two-person job, so my wonderful mother stepped up to help me get this done. She would hold the board in place on the outside while I got the screws put in from the inside. Now I will get that small 3/4 by 3/4 piece of round over trim that I had made previously fit along the top edge of the hull. To get a consistent glue line along the length of the upper rail, I again had to use every clamp that I own. But after that epoxy had cured for about 12 hours, I was able to come back and remove all the clamps and move on to the other side. So the next morning I was able to come back and remove all the clamps and all the tape and finally get a look at how these rails turned out overall. Of course, I did leave the fore and aft ends of the rub rails a little long so that they'll be able to join in with the trim that goes on the transom and also the bowsprit forward. Overall, I'm very pleased with how these turned out. Even though I'm a long way from being done, I feel like these rails are the first step in giving a finished look to the project so far. Although it may not be obvious in the video, I felt like these rails were one of the more fiddly and tedious jobs in the build so far. I'm glad they're done, and I'm excited to move on to the next step. In the next video, I think we'll move on to the cabin. I think that should be interesting, as I plan on deviating from the plans somewhat in regards to the shape of the cabin. As always, I appreciate you watching, and if you have not already done so, please subscribe. And I hope you will join me next time as we continue to build the Stevenson Weekender Sailboat.